So this week we are talking about the early republic and political division in the early republic, where you have two major parties that are basically rivaling each other for power in the new government. Okay, and we have six sort of events and things that occur that further deepen these political divisions between two parties. The two parties that we're going to be talking about are primarily the Federalists and the Republicans. And Republicans are basically the new anti-Federalists. They've changed their name, they've changed some of their ideas, but essentially it's a lot of the same people like James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and so on. Okay, and on the left there is Alexander Hamilton, who leads the Federalist Party. So those are the two rival leaders. In the election of 1788, George Washington, we know, is the first president, and his vice president is John Adams. Okay, both are Federalists, and the executive branch is now led by this group of men. Congress is also led by the Federalists, who take power. There are 91 seats in Congress during this time, and 44 of them are taken by Federalists, which means they've taken almost half the seats available. And with control of the legislative branch and the executive branch, the Federalists are going to shape what the government's going to become in these early days of the Republic. Okay, and these are cabinet members that Washington chooses: Edmund Randolph, Thomas Jefferson, Henry Knox, and Alexander Hamilton. These are the men that will be his closest advisors, and all but Jefferson are Federalists. Jefferson, though, remember, is the leader of the Republican Party, and Hamilton is the leader of the Federalist Party. So you have these two political rivals that are working very close together in helping Washington address challenges in the country. And the first challenge that they try to address is the economic challenge. At this time, the country still has enormous debt, and they have very high inflation from the overprinting of money to solve those problems. Okay, now Jefferson and Hamilton disagree very much on how to do this, but Hamilton's plan is obviously to pay the debt down. In order for the United States to be taken seriously around the world, they have to show that they can pay back this debt first, and if they can pay back the debt from the war, then other countries will be likely to loan them money again, and they can be taken seriously on the international stage. Okay, the second part of the plan is to raise taxes in order to pay down that debt, and he wanted to create a national bank where those tax dollars could be taken in, and then the debt could be paid from this national bank. Okay, and this national bank was going to house what would be the national debt. His plan is a little complicated, but what he essentially wanted to do was to take every state's individual debt that they had sort of racked up throughout the Revolution and put it into one big pool where it would be housed at the national bank. Okay, it would clean the slates for the states, and it would allow the national government to take control of that. Okay, and in order to pay that back, he would tax. A new federal tax would pay for this debt, and it would all be housed here at the national bank. Okay, well, the Southerners had a bit of a problem with this, and many Southern states were Republican majority. Many of them had a problem with this because they had already paid back their war debt, and so they were against this idea of paying another tax to pay down someone else's debt. They didn't think that was quite fair. And then also the Republicans said there's no national bank, quote unquote, in the Constitution. There's nothing that allows for this. And so they went back and forth pretty intensely because remember, Republicans want a small national government, and this is an example of the Federalists wanting a very big, bold government. But they do agree to compromise, and we'll talk about that compromise later. But in 1791, Congress finally approves Hamilton's plan, and it goes into effect. And Washington also approves of it and goes along with Hamilton and disagrees with Jefferson. Okay, so this is sort of one instance where the two parties disagree pretty passionately. Another instance is how to deal with England. England at this time is still a bit of a thorn in the side of America. They have troops and forts still in western territories like Ohio, where Kentucky is today, Pennsylvania, and they have troops there as well. And this is sort of a threat to America, obviously, with foreign soldiers in the country. They're also beginning to seize American ships and take and destroy cargo that's on these ships, and this is a very vengeful act, mostly for the Revolution and for American independence. And then also this idea or this tactic of impressing American sailors, like not impressing the way we understand it, but impressing at this time meant that they would go on board another ship, take the sailors on it, and make them work for the British Navy. And this was a tactic they used because the British Navy was very low on manpower, and this was a way for them to get more people to work for them. And obviously, this is a huge problem for America. So George Washington sends over the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Jay, and he tries to work out a treaty with the British and gets them to agree on a couple things. First, they agree to remove all the troops and forts in the West, which is good, and then they agree to pay all the damages done to the ships that they've either destroyed or the cargo that they've destroyed. So he gets them to pay those damages. And then the final part that really brings a lot of disagreement is the fact that he didn't get England to agree to stop the impressment of American soldiers. And so this point here really raises a lot of controversy, a lot of anger. And although Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, the Federalists, Congress agree with John Jay that this is the best deal they're going to get with England, and they sign off on the treaty, the Republicans are very angry about it all. So it's another instance of the two parties disagreeing. And that sort of carries over into the French Revolution. Now, along with this treaty, America has sort of created a friendship with Great Britain. And during this time, the French Revolution is occurring, where you have thousands of common folk, common people, that have rose up to take over the king. And it started in 1789, but in 1793, 4 years later, the king and queen of France were dead, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. So the French Revolution was successful in overthrowing the king, but it took a strange turn where it got very violent, and nearly 20,000 people were killed and executed because they were either a French noble, a French aristocrat, or family members of those French leaders. And so 20,000 men, women, and children were killed, and during this time they declare war on England. And this is a bit of a problem for America. One, Republicans continued to support this revolution. Even after the violence, they said, well, it's just the price you have to pay for freedom. And the Republicans felt a very close tie to the French Revolution. But the Federalists saw this as a huge threat and were fearful that many Americans would sort of follow suit and begin trying to overthrow the national government. And so the Federalists quit supporting the revolution. So again, these two parties differ on their points of view. And the Federalists during this time say they're going to stay neutral, which means they're going to stay out of the war between France and England. And Thomas Jefferson disagrees with this vehemently. And this is sort of the last straw for him, where he's tried to advise Washington, and Washington has disagreed with him almost at every turn. And so Jefferson resigns his post as Secretary of State. And after that resignation, America comes across another crisis where the two parties disagree, and that is the Whiskey Rebellion. And the Whiskey Rebellion results from the new taxes that are taking place have raised the price of whiskey. And just like the Sugar Act raised the price of rum, it makes the people that make this product and try to sell it very angry because it hurts their business. Now, a bunch of these whiskey makers rise up in protest, and Washington sends in 13,000 troops to calm this rebellion, and because he believed that it was a threat to the national government and that it was his role to protect the national government. And Jefferson believed this was a direct violation of these people's liberty. They were trying to petition the government to protest peacefully, and they're sent away by American soldiers. And Jefferson had a real problem with this. So this, again, is an instance where Republicans and Federalists disagree on important events of the time. Now, Jefferson decides to run in 1796 for president against John Adams. Washington has stepped down after 2 terms, but Adams is able to actually claim the presidency, but Jefferson becomes the vice president. So we have, once again, a cabinet, vice president, president, where there's 2 different parties and a lot of disagreement. And during this time, there's a lot of criticism of Adams, both personal and political, talking about how he is a tyrant, he's trying to become a king, and most of this anger is coming from people like Jefferson and writers that Jefferson has hired to write nasty things about Adams. A big part of the audience they're writing to are the immigrants, in America at this time, most of who are French. And so there's this sort of swelling underneath of people that really don't like Adams. And Adams, again, is very sensitive about all this. And he creates the Alien and Sedition Acts along with the Federalist Congress. And what it says is it now takes, instead of 5 years to become a citizen, it now takes 14 years to become a citizen. He wanted to punish the immigrant community that was criticizing him so much. He also said that the president is able to kick out any immigrants that he sees as a quote-unquote threat. And then finally, it restricted people's rights to criticize the government in whole. And this is obviously a direct violation of the First Amendment. And Jefferson, makes that clear in his writing, and then other people make that clear in their writing. And they continue to criticize Adams throughout his presidency. And by the time 1800 comes along, we have a new president, and that is, in fact, Thomas Jefferson. Okay, and this leads what we would like to call the Republican Revolution. In the time period leading up to the election, two states, Kentucky and Virginia, stepped up and said, we are not going to follow the Alien and Sedition Acts. We are going to nullify them, which means, once again, you're not going to follow the federal laws. And they were successful in doing that. Jefferson wins the election of 1800, and he's sort of a champion for these states that believe in states' rights and a small federal government. And then a couple years later, in 1802, the Alien and Sedition Acts are overturned. And again, this is part of the Republican Revolution. The Federalists had a good time in power. Republicans sort of swing it back in their favor, and they're able to take control of this new nation. And sort of the last saga in all this is this man here, Aaron Burr, who we probably wouldn't know much about if it weren't for his famous incident with Alexander Hamilton. Both of these men did not like each other. You have Aaron Burr, who's a Republican, later turned independent, but is actually still a Republican, and Alexander Hamilton, who's a Federalist. And in 1791, Burr defeats Hamilton's father-in-law for a seat in Congress. And this angers Hamilton because he's lost a supporter, and it was his father-in-law. And so Aaron Burr and him do not get along. In fact, they battle in Congress for many years to come. And then in 1800, Burr is running against Jefferson, actually ties him, and they have all these tie-breaking ballots where they continue to tie. And finally Hamilton steps in and says, I throw my support behind Thomas Jefferson, a man that I vehemently disagree with and hate, but I'd rather see Thomas Jefferson as president than the scoundrel Aaron Burr. And so this is, again, a slight on Aaron Burr. He ends up losing the election. Thomas Jefferson wins, and these two men have their rivalry sort of continues on. And then in 1804, Aaron Burr is running for governor of New York, and Hamilton steps in once again, saying what a bad person Aaron Burr is, and that he doesn't want to see him become the governor of New York. And finally, in 1804, these two men meet in New Jersey, and Aaron Burr obviously does not like Alexander Hamilton and vice versa, and they go to the dueling grounds in New Jersey, where Aaron Burr puts a bullet into Alexander Hamilton and kills him. And this just goes to show sort of the intense nature of politics at the time. That we had gone from 1789, where the Federalists took control, that by 1804, now the Republicans were in power. The tide had turned. States' rights were strengthened because of the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, and because Thomas Jefferson was in power, states' rights had improved. And then Hamilton, who was this hero early on, sort of waned. He was highly criticized in the public, and then by 1804, when he faced Aaron Burr, he died. This shows again the intense feelings of the time period. And then the 12th Amendment had been passed at this time as well. And this amendment basically states that there's a problem with having two separate political parties in the same president and vice president grouping. So what it said was you could now vote for a president, and you could also vote for a vice president. So it got rid of that 1-2 system where you had the second place winner as the vice president. It said you could pick whatever vice president you wanted in separate from the president itself. Okay, so that 12th Amendment was as a result of the political division of the time. And then also by 1804, the age of Jefferson had begun. When he was elected in 1800, he had big ideas in his leadership in both domestic politics, which is in America, and then also how to deal with foreign countries were new ideas. And he was seen as successful in that. And the age of Jefferson we will continue to talk about because it's an important part of history. Okay. Now, if you have any questions, make sure let me know. It's a lot of stuff today, I know, but make sure tweet, email, whatever. But make sure that you get a hold of me if you're not understanding something. And yeah, all right. Well, have a good day.